Yeah, go ahead.
I haven't watched that recording yet. I've not listened to that recording yet, so that'll be okay listening to that after this one, will I? After
Yeah, that's fine. That should be okay. Because I think the topics, in this particular unit, the way they are arranged, they do not tend to be interrelated. But yes, I think because the whole idea of this particular unit is that you're actually picking up a lot of tools and techniques which are used, within the management in terms of operations management. So you should be okay. I don't think it'll cause any major concern, or I think they're pretty much different. So just a quick recap in terms of what I did cover in this session. I think after having understood the importance of operations within an organization, the roles, responsibilities, the different types, and how and which level of strategy operation actually concentrates on, we went on to do the second outcome, which basically spoke about the importance of meeting targets, and how these targets were important to ensuring that the business is able to achieve various kind of goals, financial goals, productivity goals, performance goals, things like that. And then the third learning outcome, which is what I did last week, primarily was looking at how do we look at measuring performance. Now, a lot of organizations, when we work within companies or organizations, we do get to see that at any given point in time, our job description consists of certain activities which are day-to-day routine activities, certain activities which are more or less operational, and to a certain extent, some activities are strategic nature. That means you tend to work on those activities over a period of time, and they tend to have either be building blocks to some sort of overall achievement in terms of goal for the department, or maybe building blocks for the overall achievement of a particular goal and objective for the organization. So in learning outcome 3, what we looked at was primarily looked at a range of techniques which are used to evaluate performance. Now, we can look at a lot of techniques, but the few techniques that we looked at were, one was specifically related to the unit, was management by objectives. And this is something which was introduced, by Peter Drucker, but primarily meant that here the management is focused on, achievable goals, and they put the best possible resources to try and achieve those goals. So they do not look at individual goals, but they look at everybody working within the organization to try and achieve the organizational goal. Now, this as a concept gave way to a balanced scorecard concept, which came in the early 1990s. And this was more focused on, actually translating the original vision and mission set by the board for the company or organization every year into meaningful and measurable, achievable targets. So this then led to the creation of something called SMART targets. But what I did was I went through these two, techniques of how performance evaluation is normally done within the operations side of things, because it has a lot of inputs, and what is required is you need a performance management technique which allows you to measure and bring in each and every aspect, of let's put it this way, the overall objective. Because some of these objectives that I work on, as an example, that I've been, looking at, say, as a part of the team to launch a particular product. But launch of that particular product might also be dependent on things like what is the budget or finances available, what are the contributions by other team members, things like the product manager or maybe the events manager, or in some cases you look at the support teams which work to bring the product, like engineering and management. And to a certain extent, once the thing has gone through as a full, kind of a activity, what are the learnings which could be brought in to try and, streamline or learn as we want to do from some of the gap areas which basically should not happen again. So this kind of a technique was focused on to looking at measuring achievable objectives primarily in the talent scorecard. And this came across, there are lots of manifestations of it in terms of how you can bring in a lot of factors, and this kind of helps you incorporate, broadly all the possible type of goals which the organization needs to achieve. And sometimes we talk about, things like, okay, this could have been slightly better, or we could have achieved better results if that was available, or or if this was done, then we could have achieved an overall higher percentage in terms of achievement. Now, keeping that in mind, the balanced scorecard looks at primarily bringing all measurable parameters from all different aspects when an activity is done or a project is done in on a smaller scale, but on an organizational level, you're looking at primarily including all the types of resources and what is the contribution of each type of resource in helping you to achieve that objective. So primarily we looked at things like how do we look at performance evaluation, and then one of the other concepts which has come out in the early 2000s, with the use of let's put it this way, with the indication of key performance indicators, which primarily came across from the Japanese organization Toyota. And this focused on the fact that we need to look at all parameters which help in the contribution or achievement of that objective, but we have to rank these parameters basis their priority in helping to achieve that objective. And the KPIs as a term became quite important because broadly resources could be kind of put into two categories: financial or non-financial. That means they're direct kind of implication to finances if production delays happen, or if the output or these say material management was not done in time, or if the products were not received in time. It all led to time, quality, kind of a cost and compromise, and that is where KPIs came about. So KPIs became quite popular, and this is something which is an approach is followed in a lot of production, engineering, or people-oriented organizations, wherein the focus is actually done on processes, so that if the processes are followed, then the individuals are able to be more efficient and more productive. So these were three major concepts that we discussed in terms of the presentation last time, and this is something that you can go through. And what I did was I also probably included a handout to give you a bit more reading in terms of understanding why organizations, after streamlining operations, put some performance management techniques or evaluation techniques in place to be able to ensure and pinpoint the gap areas, and that is where they want to focus on processes to be able to improve it. Now, some organizations would look at management by objective, which is a services organization. Some of them would look at balanced scorecard because there are too many deliverables, too many departments, too many people involved. So they have to have a very clear-cut distinction in terms of what role, what department, what organization, or what SBU, strategic business unit, plays in the overall production of that product or service, and they use balanced scorecard. But in some of the more production oriented, engineering oriented organizations, what we do get to see is the use of KPIs in particular, which is looking at the key performance indicators for any role, any job, any activity, or any sort of objective. So that is why we tend to look at dividing them into SMART in particular, which is something which is measurable, achievable, realistic, time bound, and it can actually bring in the results. Now, after having understood this particular learning outcome 3, which is going in a bit of a stepwise fashion to understand where operations and what all does it cover, we are going on to now looking at the last one in this particular unit, which talks about the role of quality. There is something that we have always seen. There is something called a cost triangle, and that has basically 3 sides to it. So there is, or whichever way you look at it, some of them, I might call it the cost triangle. If I'm focusing on cost, then I will look at quality and time as the other 2 halves, or the other 2 sides. If I look at quality triangle, then I would look at cost and time. If I look at time, then I would look at cost and quality. So they tend to form an equation wherein if one of the factors is not appropriate or is not adequately kind of provision, then it leads to a compromise in the output with regards to the other 2 factors. So generally speaking, quality is always inversely dependent on time and cost. So if we put in more time and we put in more cost, what we will see is the quality of the product to a certain extent would not suffer, and we will see the output that we get, or the product or service that we get, would be top-notch quality. Now, here in this learning outcome 4, we are looking at broadly understanding 3 areas. One is we need to understand how we look at, for example, a range of techniques which help us evaluate performance. Now, beyond the three that we have looked at last time, we look at one of the other tools, which is called the value chain analysis, VCA. Again, something which was which is proposed by Potter, and that is what we will learn. And how do we apply this into an organization, and why is it important? The other bit that we will look at is, in this particular outcome, we will look at the importance of quality and how quality improvements happen within the organization or any particular department. And the third part leading on to from there would be to look at understanding the role of organizations which set these standards. So like we hear about ISO, we hear about total quality management, we look at EFQM, the European Foundation for Quality Management. Now, these organizations over the years have come up with certain standards, and what we need to be able to do at this level is to understand what they are and how they are applied. That's it. So theoretically, we want to know that what these organizations do and how do they help bring standards or set standards within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm just frantically writing notes.
Okay, good stuff. Right. So just jumping on to pretty much straight away, the task 4.1. Now here, what we want to do is we need to understand what is the, certain terms like value chain and value chain analysis. Now, these are important tools that we look at in particular when we talk about, in general about the, how an organization actually looks at gaining competitive advantage. And the reason why we look at these tools in particular is that it helps us clearly understand how and what factors affect the organization or the business internally, what factors affect the organization externally. Now, there are lots of other tools that we can look at, things like at the very basic level, we look at SWOT analysis, we look at PESTEL, but at the business level, we look at some of the other tools like Ansoff Matrix, we look at the Boston Consulting Group, BCG Matrix. But I think when we have to look at it from an operational point of view, when we need to look at it from a point of view of individual activities, individual departments, all, and look at their individual contribution in terms of the achievement of overall objective, what we do is we basically look at using this strategic tool, which is value chain analysis. Now, looking at just the concept and definition of these terms, so value chain basically represents or talks about the internal activities of a firm. That means, as you know, in the initial stages, we discussed that when you look at an operational process or a production process, what we do get to see is you have a lot of raw material like inputs, and which are converted into an output by somebody in the middle, and that middle part is nothing but the process, and that is the value addition which an organization or a business does to convert the raw material as inputs into output, which are sold as products and services. So there are a lot of activities which happen within the organization, which are internal to the organization, and they then help transform that raw material into some sort of output. There are lots of inputs which happen. There is a lot of say for example, if it's an automobile industry, we look at, there's a lot of fabrication which happens. They bring in a lot of suppliers. They supply a lot of materials and things like that. But at the end of it, the finished product just has the brand name of a particular automobile manufacturer, say for example Nissan or Jaguar. But at the end of the day, they might not be producing all the things which go into the car or the assembly of the car. But because the whole process of integrating and manufacturing that particular thing happens within the company, these are all part of internal activities. Now, when we look at doing a bit of analysis in terms of how these inputs are transformed into output, we call it, or this was what was called the value chain analysis. And as a process, it kind of helps identify what are the key activities and what are the ancillary or supporting activities which are required to get to the final product. So if I look at just taking to Jaguar as an example, and the key, say the automobile manufacturer, here they produce most of the things themselves. For example, the engine of the car is produced by them. But when I say it's produced by them, does not mean that every nut and bolt or everything in the engine which is produced by the company is produced by Jaguar itself. No. So what they look at is the primary activity is that they have to put together this engine, but the support activities is that a lot of the raw material to create that engine for a car would actually come in from maybe suppliers, partners, other manufacturers. And that is why sometimes we get to hear, when we hear the term that, if the car, if a particular factory is to close, it does not just directly reflect the number of jobs affected in that factory, but also with a lot of suppliers and their partners who provide or supply those products. So value chain analysis basically looks at, that process of identifying what are the key activities and what are the supporting activities, and how these activities contribute to the creation of, the final product. Now, that is where the process of operations is actually applied, because if they can manufacture everything in-house and still achieve an X cost, and then towards the end when they sell the product profit, then they would do it in-house. But because sometimes that's not possible, so they look at vertical as well as horizontal integration, and that is where this particular tool actually comes in handy to try and understand the whole concept of production, and where all the company actually can actually save costs, or save time and improve quality. They always look at it from these three angles: time, cost, and quality. And that is what we look at in this particular tool, which is value chain analysis. Now, the reason why a lot of organizations, the next question would be, which will come to your mind or you'll be looking to ask, is why do they need to do this analysis? Now, value chain analysis basically looks at, as over the years, over the last couple of decades, what we've seen is there has been a lot of improvements in technology in particular. And technology is becoming smarter, which is making us much more productive, efficient, and mostly what you'll see is there is a vast improvement happening in the quality of products that we use. So if you look at, just as an example, a vague example, you look at televisions in the 1970s, not 70s, maybe the 80s and the 70s, they were only black and white. They were huge. They were based on something called cathode ray tube, or CRT. But when the technology started to move, we started to get, they became color TVs first. And then after the invention of plasma, or, the OLED, as we call it, the size and everything has become, it has changed. So if you look at it, took maybe, I don't know, God knows, 30, 40, 50 years for us to have a television. But after that, the color actually came in 30, 40 years. But if you look at how quickly the cycle is shortened in terms of getting from the CRT to the, almost razor thin, televisions today, in terms of OLED screens, the time period for that gap in terms of, the advancement in its technology is reduced. Now, the reason why this is happening is, simple answer, most firms are looking at getting some sort of competitive advantage, and this competitive advantages are coming across because of the use of advancements in technology, which they are integrating into their production process. So if you understand and see this particular slide, which is on your screen, it talks about, the primary activities of the business, which is how Porton defined. So it talks about primary activities. That means when the product is being delivered to the factory, say Jaguar again, they look at logistics of where material, which warehouse it will be stored, or what will be required and when it will be required. There's a bit of operations, which is obviously entirely internal. They look at outbound. Once the finished product is ready, they park the car outside, and after that it's loaded on, and it goes for delivery. So till the time it is loaded on and it is onwards for delivery, it is still the primary activity of the car manufacturer. Now, they generate a lot of sales and marketing. That means they generate the demand for the product, and to a certain extent they are directly involved in terms of dealerships and promotional campaigns and things like that. And because there is a direct involvement from the company, even if the company employs advertising agencies, they still have to approve the creative. They go by the brand guidelines. It is still classified as a primary activity. And then to a certain extent, when the car is serviced, if you bought a car and you're an owner of a Jaguar car, for the first 3 years, the service is with the company, and you normally would take it to the same dealership where you get it serviced, and that's why services are also classified as a primary activity. Now, underneath that, what you see is a lot of support activities. So in order to keep this operation going, what you get to see is that the infrastructure, it could be a lease factory, it could be a factory owned by them on a long-term lease, whatever it is. Procurement that they do, which is people who work within the purchase department, people who work within HR, and people who work within the systems and IT side of things in terms of technology, they will all be basically forming a part and parcel of something called the support side of the activities or departments that they will do. But basis the two, the ones in the blue and the ones in the orange, will always determine what the company's goal in terms of profitability is, because the idea is the management would set goals and objectives in a way wherein they want to maximize profit, value for the shareholders, dividends for for the shareholders. But this can only be achieved if both primary and support activities are clearly differentiated and they know exactly what percentage cost is actually incurred in running those services or activities. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, what do? We basically look at, why do you think companies or organizations would look at doing this big, analysis in terms of understanding and breaking activities down into, various aspects of, okay, this is this, this is that, and this falls within this department, this falls here within this cost head or a cost center, would be that they essentially want to look at, kind of nailing it down to a fact that which areas do not contribute enough, or which areas are costing enough, or are costing, a certain percentage in terms of running it, operating it, managing it. And the whole idea of looking at that as a concept is that they want to look at, optimizing those costs there to be able to get some advantage. That means if they are able to shave off some costs because of, in say, for example, use of a better technology, or if it helps shave off a bit of time on the production line, if they bring in some, like, it's a real example is that why most of the firms now within this industry employ robots, for example, for welding and other services when they're putting the chassis together, is because it reduces time, it reduces, the quality is absolutely not compromised, but at the same time it reduces, cost, because quality not being compromised, the welds being applied correctly, and this is something which can happen 24/7. So they do not have to have things like change of shifts or, breaks and things like that. So that side of function is totally automated now. And the idea why they've done this is that allows them to increase production in terms of number of cars happening, across a day or across a shift drastically. And the reason why this has been done is using the value chain analysis. They've identified a process within the production which can be totally automated, and that would help them gain competitive advantage. Now, competitive advantage can be classified into two. One is, are they looking at saving costs, or are they looking at, creating a differentiation? So when you look at saving costs, you have a cost advantage. When you look at basically differentiation because of a process being applied or a new technology being applied or an implementation being done to create something different, then it will be called a differentiation advantage. Now, this is what this tool helps the organization apply. And when you look at applying cost advantage, sorry, I don't know, are you on the desktop now?
I've just got it up on my screen. Yeah.
That's fine.
So
Okay.
if I just close this on my phone.
Yeah, that'll be fine. You'll be still on this desktop as a conference. So basically what tends to happen is when you look at applying the cost advantage, you will follow a certain series of steps to gain that as an advantage in operations. And when you look at differentiation, now you can look at, also you look at using VC as a differentiation tool. That would typically, look at helping you create differentiation, but you have to follow a few steps. So for example, differentiation advantage is primarily, so that's mostly focused on, the customer side of things. And that is where you will typically tend to see that, focusing on what the customers want and their needs would help create differentiation. So that means a company would do a lot of research, collect feedback, and, they would also look at voice of customer by engaging with their existing customers to be able to gain, insight into the requirements of what they actually want. And that would help them then, obviously follow something called differentiation strategy and then offer something different. So let's look at, for example, a case in point. When you look at, car manufacturers, you typically tend to see that there are lots of, I know you've dropped in, dropped out, but okay, you're back now. So
yes, I'm really sorry about that.
No, no, that's okay. So when you look at this particular differentiation strategy, what we talk about is that they follow something which the customers are asking for, and they look at the customer needs in particular. And here they invest a lot of time and effort in understanding the customer's demand, the voice of the customer, what features and functions they want. So if I look at the car industry and we stick to that as an example today, you see a lot of variants of car models. And the reason why they have a lot of these variants of car models which are at different price points is because they focused on certain types of customers. So you can buy a Series 3 or a Series 5 or an XF, a different type of Jaguar cars, but all of them seem to have a key differentiation, and they seem to be kind of always be positioned towards a different type of target audience. So if you look at the XF, it's more or less a larger car which primarily is in the limousine category. They might want to kind of position it towards the senior management, top officials, people who can afford a chauffeur, things like that. So there is a bit of a R&D, or let's put it this way, when I say research and development, is that they have gone in to do and understand why customers look at this kind of a model, what are the key parameters, and what are the reasons why they would want to look at buying something on this side where there is a price differentiation, and that would help them look at focusing on the customer's need, customer demands, and what they actually want. And there the customizations available in the model would be, they might give you 10 options in terms of the interiors of the car, which is in terms of leather seats and things like that. Different colors could be chosen and different engine sizes could be chosen. And that would essentially allow them to reap more profit with a different type of target audience. And that would also mean that the reason why they have produced that as a model allows them to create a bit of a differentiation when others in their competition are not able to offer a model equivalent to that car. So you will get to see when you look at Audis and you look at the Mercedes and the BMWs and the Jaguars, they all seem to have corresponding models at any given point in time comparing. So the Series 3 is equal to this, the Series 5 is equal to this, or the Audi A4 is equal to this, or the Mercedes, this is equal to that. And the reason why they want to do is they want to look at a differentiation advantage, wherein the idea is listening to the customer allows them to put a structure in place which helps them create a model with different features, different aspects in terms of usefulness, and that helps them command a bit of premium or a different set of pricing than what is available in the market from competition. Now, what I've done on this particular slide, if I go full screen, is basically looking at an example of of this particular tool, which is value chain analysis. And I picked up this from a particular website wherein what they've done is within the automobile manufacturing as a company, say let's look at Jaguar, they've done the analysis to show using this tool that how the company can look at achieving cost advantage. And this analysis primarily is internal, to the key set of activities rather than the support activities. So what they've done is they've used the value chain analysis tool. They've divided that into the costs have been divided across 6 departments. They look at engineering and design, purchase material and components. They look at production or assembly. They look at quality, which is in terms of testing, then sales and marketing, and then they look at distribution, dealer support for service and sales. And they've attributed costs and then looked at the key drivers of costs within those categories. And then what they've done is, in order to achieve cost advantage, because we're looking at cost advantage rather than differentiation, they've looked at implementing a series of steps to try and achieve that advantage, which allows them to price their models or bring across features in the models which are far more superior or in price comparison are cheaper as compared to what maybe the other car manufacturer would produce. So this is how the tool is actually applied, and this is something which can be applied across any field. So if I, for example, pick up Rochdale College, you might look at the cost of delivering a program, or in my own company, if I look at the cost of delivering a particular program, what I would do is basically differentiate it into, divide it into different activities that we do. It could be things like, in registration, enrollment, we look at teaching and learning, we look at assessment, verification, and towards the end certification. Now, some of these activities are direct. That means they are primary activities. If I don't teach and deliver, that means there's no way that we can run the program or offer the program. But when I look at some of the other activities like assessment, verification, or certification, some of these activities are not primary activities to us, and they are primary activities, or we work on them, and then they become the secondary activities for us and primary activities for the awarding organization. So there, the cost is support costs rather than direct costs. And in order to create that differentiation, we look at each of these individual cost heads and say, okay, I can save some bit here, I can do this and create a bit of differentiation, maybe ask for a bit higher price, things like that. And that is how it will allow me to, apply that model to any business or any particular situation. Now, the picture on the left-hand side basically also, now this particular model is why it's important, is because the value chain can be done across a sector or within a particular organization. So basically, if you look at VC, you can apply this, across the sector and then correlate it to the business or the organization in general within that sector. So we look at, if I just go back to the example of education, so we look at within Manchester area, now we have lots of different colleges, FE colleges, universities, and we have to apply, if you have to apply the VCA model across, the various institutions in Manchester, what that would basically do is we will have to look at the vertical, which is the education vertical. Now within that, divided into further and higher education. And once we have FE colleges on further education, we have universities on higher education. Then we can look at various, costs which are associated. And in the case of, say, Manchester College, if they want to apply it because they work with Salford and they also work with, say, Metropolitan in terms of degree awarding powers, what they would look at is calculating the cost of where their students could achieve, degrees cheaper with, without compromising cost and quality in terms of league rankings, but still work with them in terms of agreements like articulation and, tie-ups. So that will help them kind of understand costs, but also help them understand where they are spending more or where they can look at actually saving costs to be able to apply, let's put it this way, differentiation, so that they can attract more students to come in and study with them. And then if they want to follow the degree route, they can also get that within their system by having, tie-ups with universities to be able to deliver the degrees, but awarded by the university. Is that okay?
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay, so going to the second bit, which we are looking at covering, is how do we understand, we talk about this cost. And so when we look at the triangle, we talk about, cost, time, and quality. So we've understood that if we have to apply and understand where costs are incurred in what side of operations, we can use one of the tools like value chain analysis to be able to understand that. But next thing that we look at is to understand how quality improvement can actually, benefit the organization, both in terms of saving costs, but also in terms of saving times for production. Now, here we have to understand a few key concepts, things like, quality assurance, for example. Why is quality assurance essentially required? Even so, when we look at, the aspect of, any organization. So when we look at quality assurance, here we talk about, things which could have various meanings. So, for example, the various meanings could be that if we look at buying something in the market, to me, the quality is if I get that in price, in that particular price, or if I get the best in that particular category, that to me could be quality. Quality could be something which, if I buy the product is very reliable, doesn't go faulty at all. That to me could be quality. So there are various meanings of when we look at quality. Now, when we understand quality could be that I want to, as a sensible or as a rational customer, I want to get something from the market which comes to me at a very, affordable kind of a price, but also is quite reliable in terms of products when I go out and buy. So an example here would be, I can think of is, for example, if you want to look at buying a Hoover or a vacuum cleaner. Now, what you do is, there are lots of options in the market, but sometimes what you do is when you're up against the price, you're saying, okay, I don't want to spend more than this much because they only have a limited lifespan of 2 or 3 years. And I might as well get something, like a wax or something, rather than going for the best in the category would be Dyson. So what you do is you benchmark And to you, the quality side of things could be, okay, because I'm up against the budget, I might buy a different brand. But to me, the quality is Dyson, and that is what then kind of becomes synonymous with something in the market wherein the product is very reliable. It is something that you buy once and use it for years. And that is the definition of quality as far as the products are concerned. So when you are looking at a balancing cost versus quality, what you do is, okay, I want to buy the best. I think I want to buy it for have peace of mind, buy with this because of the features and the other things it provides as well. When the Dyson Ball vacuum cleaner actually came out, so a lot of people said, okay, it's too expensive. It's, I think, 270, 280 pounds, something like that. And yes, it does offer an innovative feature, but I think it's too much to ask for in terms of expense. So, though they like the product, they bought something else. Now, the whole process of applying quality starts when they start looking at customers' needs and demands. And that is where they put a process in place, which is then kind of looking at all these things becomes something called, why does that company produce a product which is of such high quality, which means reliability. And that process is what they call as quality assurance. Now, quality assurance is something which is applied across all departments, but more so within the operations and productions department, is because this is what helps them save time. When I say save cost, save time, or save time and save cost, it can happen concurrently. Now, this is something which is applied across these organizations, wherein what they do is, for services which are much more challenging, that means to achieve a particular reliability in a product, it requires more efforts to be put in terms of whether it's the time spent to test, whether it's to look at producing or production of it, is basically the whole process of applying quality assurance. That means we produce something, and that is quality assured. And when customers buy, they have peace of mind. They can think of it as reliability. Now, some of the things that I can relate to is when you look at the adverts of mattresses, for example, when they are done. There's one in particular which is now on telly quite aggressively. What they show is that they are testing the mattress, for its strength in terms of durability. Now, when you look at that particular concept, what they're trying to do is they're trying to show that something that you buy from us lasts for years and years, and it is thoroughly and rigorously tested, and it's quality assured. That means we have tried and tested that under different conditions before we even put it to market, or we sell it in the market. And that process which they are applying to test rigorously the product is actually nothing but they are applying the different variations of conditions under which the product is going to be used, to try and see if the product conforms to those guidelines of benchmarks which have been set for testing, is the process of nothing but quality assurance. So we need to understand different aspects of quality assurance. And sometimes when you look at this in services side of organizations, so if you forget production or manufacturing, what you will get to see is that sometimes you will see in the services organization, they apply the concept of quality as well. So let's look at, when you look at BT and Ofgen or Ofcom, for example, they look at every year releasing surveys. They say, okay, most of the complaints received for broadband, for example, have been with BT as a company. And the reason why they've had those complaints is because the phone calls are not responded on time. The hold times are quite high as far as customers calling in. And that is where they get to see that we get to see this as a process, is that the whole idea of quality process being applied to a services side of organizations, wherein the people working on customer services, when they pick up the phone, it's expected that you pick it up within 4 rings. It's expected that the wait time should not exceed half an hour. And then the problems which need to be resolved should be resolved on the phone or through remote support. Now, these are things which they've defined in the processes of support. But if they are not meant, or if they are not compliant with the things that they've defined, then these side of things lead to slippages in quality of services being provided by the organization. Now, it could involve a call center, outsourcing, things like that. But at the end of the day, it is compromising the brand and the service which the company delivers from a point of view of quality and quality assurance as a process. Now, very briefly, we'll look at a couple of slides just to understand, what do we mean when we look at the process of, quality improvement within production, or, the concept of operations management. Now, here, if I just make this slide slightly bigger, now there are a couple of techniques. One is, if I understand, sticking to the theme of what we've discussed today with regards to a manufacturing or a production organization like an automobile company, what we do get to see is that one of the things that they look at when they look at improving operations is they look at materials management, because it involves inventory. It involves inventory which can be held up in the warehouses for a number of days, number of hours, days, weeks, and months, which could mean cost at the end of the day because they're ordering things in advance to keep the production going. Now, this is very important for an organization which uses inputs or uses raw materials as inputs to produce outputs or goods and services. So a very famous example was that when we look at Ford and some of the other companies, we do get to see that sometimes if they do not have enough material in terms of inventory, then the production comes to a halt. Or if there's a defect which has been detected, then the production comes to a halt. And this can then lead to delivery, lead times in terms of delivery to the customers, which could cost them in terms of, reputation, brand image, and even in terms of cancellation of orders. So one of the techniques that we look at is materials management. The other closely related technique that we look at is material planning. Now, this is very closely related to the fact that we talk about things like just in time. We talk about, some of the things which are required by, companies to be able to bring in as basically, which is brought in as raw material, which forms the input. But to a certain extent, this input is then, transformed into output. So material planning is something which the organization needs to do before they even start looking at producing goods and services. So if I have to say that Jaguar looks at, I think in a couple of days back, which was in the news, that Jaguar sold about or produced about 170,000 cars in the UK. Now, in order to produce and meet that target of say 170,000 or 200,000, whichever was set by the management, they need to do a bit of planning, and that planning needs to look at what is required as a raw material, or in terms of their supply chain, what will be required to be able to produce those cars and then produce them according to the plan which has been set. So they must have looked at January 2,000 cars or 20,000, for example, February 10,000, and then it follows some sort of a pattern of planning that they've done. And because they're looking at producing some numbers of cars every month, they need to do a lot of material planning, which basically requires the organization to decide, basis the overall target set, that what they will need to do and how much they will need to produce, when they will need to produce, and when their partners and suppliers would need to supply that in terms of raw material or material which is input. And that then has very close linkage to inventory control. That means they do not want a buildup of excess inventory in the plants when the models are not being produced, or there are not sufficient orders to be able to produce, because there are not sufficient orders from the market. And then the concept which falls within the material planning is also looking at something called supply chain management. And here it involves assessing, basically understanding the location when the company starts to plan or introduce a new plant or goes on an expansion drive. They look at creating or establishing something at a place wherein they do find that they have close proximity to their suppliers. What is the lead times in terms of materials being made available to the factory where the final production or assembly is happening? And that is what is important from a point of view of supply chain management. One of the key things that we look at is when you look at a lot of these companies like Apple, Amazon, and others, they have lots of warehouses across Europe. When they look at creating these distribution hubs or these very large warehouses wherein they do a lot of storage or inventory management, they do it in certain strategic locations. The reason why they choose these locations is they look at maybe financial costs, they look at manpower, they look at the distance in terms of proximity, times for delivery, and things like that. That all as a process looks at or falls under the gambit of something called supply chain management. Now, having understood that, what we want to look at is now how do we look at okay, these are all things that we've studied, things like material planning, inventory management, supply chain. We've understood these concepts, but how do you think these concepts, because each of these large processes or processes that are important to the overall operations role need to be set, and procedures need to be created from a point of view of quality. And that is where what we look at is what kind of standards are set, or what kind of a quality management system does an organization follow, which is then implemented across departments, across various facets of the business, so that they are all complying, and they are all compliant in the sense they are something which can be then measured, on a yardstick evenly with regards to any department or any service which the organization actually produces. So part of this slide looks at answering when we talked about what is quality, and how do we look at the quality. So for me or for anyone, then we look at, there are lots of definitions of quality. There's not a fixed definition, but considering the 5 different types which have over the years been accepted, we look at conformance to specification. So if you're looking at buying something, say for example, you're looking at a simple example enough would be that you're looking at, say for example, in your kitchen, maybe looking at doing tiling. Now, what you would do is you would look at calculating the area, and when you go out and look at tiles in B&Q or other places, what you look at is a certain type of specification or a color that you want, or maybe the size of the tile you want, and then you want that product, when you have chosen, to be able to kind of cover up that area, which is the tiling that you're doing in the kitchen. Now, when you look at such kind of connotations of quality, which is mostly kind of relating to specifications, is what we would go by is one type of definition of quality. The other could be fitness for use. That means fitness, in terms of what's the purpose, and does that product fit the bill? Does it something which does the job? That kind of thing. The other would be when you look at comparing it with or relating it to price or quality. And say, for example, in one case you could do is that, okay, I'm willing to spend that much, but I'm not going to go beyond that in terms of my budget. And here is where you will look at then averaging, or kind of giving a bit of priority to either quality, or you will look at, for example, price or cost in general. And then you try and do a bit of comparison. You will also say that, okay, for this much I get this, and for that I get that, this much in terms of quantity, something on those lines. Sometimes you look at measuring quality from a point of view of the support services provided. So sometimes when you get to see that, you say, for example, buy a product, and that product comes with, say, 2-year warranty, 5-year warranty, 7-year warranty, or it has, free after sales service for a number of years. Specifically, say in the car industry, we look at 3 years, which is typically the car is under companies or manufacturers warranty, but they have other warranties which extend beyond those 3-year period, things like corrosion warranty and other things. So here, in that aspect, you're looking at support services being one of the key critical factors for you to take a decision, and that is also in a definition of quality. And then if nothing comes to meet your expectation, then sometimes what you have to do is you look at psychological things that you kind of relate to, and you say prestige, you look at reputation, brand, how friendly is the staff and things like that, or how easy is it to reach the staff within the company or the organization from which you are buying or availing a product or service, is something that you also consider. And basis that, what you will see is most of the services side of organizations today look at reviews, feedbacks, customer reviews, and what they look at is that when you're buying something, you do a quick search on Google and say, okay, let me look at reviews. What are the customers saying? And that's something to look at, the psychological side of things when you look at, before you've not tried something before as a product, but what you've done is you want to be making sure that you're buying something which is quality enough, which is something reliable enough, good enough, and you're paying a price for it. What you do is you do a quick search in terms of, reviews or customer feedbacks or reviews which have been left by them, for that product if they've tried. Now, there are various standards that we look at in terms of managing or working on quality. And some of these standards, you would see that most organizations kind of adapt one or either one or more of these standards, depending on the type of operations they have within the organization. Now, ISO 9001 is one of the most acceptable standards which came about in the early 1950s. 14,000, and then we have 27,000, which is related to information, documentation and things like that, which have come up recently. There are other standards which also have come out in the ISO, but they are looked at as one of the quality standards which a lot of organizations follow within the European context. But when we look at, one of the other standards would be EFQM, European Foundation for Quality Management. EFQM is one of the standards. We look at something called Deming. He's classified as the father of, quality management. And the reason is Deming, Edward Deming. Yeah. So he's classified as the father of quality management, and he came up with the Deming's model, and that is where you will get to see that this is one of the standards which a lot of organizations have adopted over the years. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail in the next few slides. And then you have the MBN QA, which is Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Standard or Awards, which are followed across. So there are lots of different types of standards across different geographies. You look at Americas, you look at Europe, and you look at Asia. There are different quality standards. But here, what we are looking at is we're looking at just understanding them from a overview. So MBN QA is primarily, something which is more or less centric in the US. They tend to kind of look at, the standard which, was kind of created by the Reagan administration. They look at basically providing rewards if the companies are following certain procedures, and they have now been also modified or related to the corporate social responsibility, so that you're preserving the environment. Some of them are environment-related standards, and they were given to, not very many companies, and companies had to kind of, work on their processes and policies and then make sure that they're having compliance with those standards. And they were then given as kind of a gold seal of approval to a few companies in the past, or every year to certain companies, which end up meeting the standard defined by this particular organization. Now, the Deming's Prize was something which, essentially came about in the Industrial Revolution, or just before, after the World War II. And here what we did see was that it was given by a union of Japanese scientists and engineers, Edward Deming, which basically, helped improve a lot of quality related work, within manufacturing and production organizations after World War II, specifically. And they then they've been developed further. And obviously, he's called in the modern context, he's called the father of quality management, or, he's invented a lot of quality management techniques, which are then now followed by a lot of organizations. And ISO is one which obviously is a certification standard. Here, the companies or organizations actually work to achieve this particular standard, and they are of different types. So it's generally classified as 9,000, but this was they've expanded, I think, into 9,000, 14,000, and 24 and 27,000 as well, which are conforming to IT standards, information security, compliance on the documentation side and things like that. And this is more or less a global standard now with many companies. And every year they have to go through a certification process, and every 3 years they go through an audit process of ensuring the ISO standards organization does an audit, and they have to ensure that they are compliant, with this particular standards which have been set. Now, the concept of total quality management is something that we look at now. But total quality management, is again a concept which came about, and wherein Edward Deming is actually under 3 different remits actually proposed that why most organizations need to focus on something called TQM. And TQM basically, as it says, total quality means focuses on all the processes, all the departments, all the types of, basically all the functions within a business. And it impacts every particular business or function within the business or organization. And that's why the term, TQM, which came in. Now, large organizations, when we look at, they typically tend to follow the TQM's process, and that is where we see that they kind of implement different standards, different systems. But when they implement different systems, the whole idea is they want each and every department within the organization to kind of comply with some sort of quality requirements or quality mechanisms which have been set. Now here, what we will look at is, we will look at three different types. I'm just skipping one or two slides because I want to kind of focus on the main aspect of the TQM, and then the subsequent slide basically explained, in a handout that I will send, which explains in a bit more theoretical detail, things like the ISO and other bits, which might be looking at just understanding the quality standards. Now, TQM basically looks at, basically when Edward Deming came out with this particular concept, he said that the whole organization actually needs to be focused on having a commitment for improving the efficiency and improving everything that they produce. And the whole focus was on essentially quality. That means he wanted each and every employee within the organization to sign up to the commitment of doing every piece of work, which basically involved doing it to a certain level beyond which there was nothing, in terms of any compromise, or it could not develop a fault. So quality, he seeked basically saying that there's a declaration which each employee has to sign, which says that they are committed to the process of quality, and they will do everything in their powers to produce something which is a product which is defect free. From even, when you look at a service or a product, if it's in the case of production, they will try and produce a product which is defect free. And because the product is going to be defect free, or at least the organization is trying to produce something implying this particular concept, that would help reduce the cost of, things like quality testing, quality measures, or, other processes that they have to keep in place or put in place to ensure that the product or the service which is produced is not compromised. So here, this concept basically was drastically different from what the other models proposed, is because they said that we will, as an organization, we'll try and produce or provide a service which is totally flawless, which is absolutely defect free, and that, because of that particular concept, would mean that there are no ancillary or support costs which have to be spent to look at testing quality, maintaining standards, or creating benchmarks, and that would help save a lot of time and efforts from an organizational point of view if this was a pledge or a commitment which every employee actually signed up to. And in this context, what he has done is he's kind of said that in order to employ favorably TQM within an organization, this concept has to be implemented across three key I would say sides. One is employees. That means you have to empower employees, and that is what we look at in subsequent slide. The second is there has to be a concept wherein the organization always strives for continuous improvement, right? That means if there is something that has been produced, it takes a bit of time, there's an X cost. If there are ways through which they can improve the quality of the product in terms of the efficiency, for example, or in terms of in the case of car industry, for example, they want to produce a car which is much more, not a car, but an engine which is much more efficient. That means it gives much more to a liter of petrol or diesel, gives more mileage, has less noise, or does not pollute the environment. And when they bring out these standards, which are Euro emission standards, Euro 5, Euro 6, which most cars are today compliant with, what they are looking at is they are looking at improving the functioning of the internal combustion engine continuously to be able to overachieve or kind of achieve certain standards which have been set. Right? It could be emissions, for example. It could be mileage. It could be the cost that the engine produces in terms of mileage, per liter or whatever it is, and that process is continuous improvement. And the last is what he said is you need to be focused on the customer, because everything that the company produces is primarily looking at producing it for a purpose of selling. Now, if the company is not customer focused, that means they do not bring out products which are in demand or basically required by the customers. That would mean that the whole process would be detrimental to what the company is producing. So these three different concepts is what he proposed, and what he meant was that in terms of employee empowerment, he talked about the concept of creating quality circles, which meant that a lot of employees could get together. They would be working in teams, and those teams would look at analyzing each process, each design, and each aspect of the operations to try and make improvements in that. And that signing up to the concept of quality at the individual employee level, and then working in groups to be able to improve and achieve that improvement, meant that that would mean that employees were empowered. That means they were empowered with the decision making capacity. They were also highly more involved, highly motivated. They were more involved in the business or in the function that they were in terms of their job role, and that led to the overall improvement in terms of creating a product or service, and that led to substantial fall in terms of costs, in terms of savings for the organization. So one of the key concepts that he proposed was that they need to group workers together into quality circles, and they need to come up with innovative ideas to be able to look at how the things and processes could be improved. Led to the generation of ideas, more involvement, higher motivation, and then generally, higher quality products or processes being produced. The other side was looking at continuous improvement, or Kaizen, which the Japanese word basically means improvement. And this is something wherein they looked at, most of the organizations wherein they tried to look at a process wherein they could continuously keep on improving the products or services, and look at either reducing time, reducing cost, or improving quality. When we talk about that cost triangle or the quality triangle, and that is where this process is continuously employed across all Japanese organizations. So when they look at product, they say there's always room for improvement. There's always scope for improvement in terms of the services they provide, and they keep at it in terms of looking and making changes which then help achieve continuous improvement. And here the focus is primarily on striving to have this culture within the organization wherein they look at always the aspect of improving things. And the last one was basically the organization having a customer focus. Now Edward Deming basically proposed that he said that maintaining quality or producing quality goods and services was a responsibility of every employee. And there he considered that this question is that before you start or go to work, you should always ask this question, or if you're doing an activity or doing a work, you should always ask this question: is this something which is going to produce meaningful, or which the customer is asking for? Is this something which is required by the customer? And when they look at those variations, so there are lots of ideas which are generated within the organization, but sometimes some of the ideas are taken up which do not have any merits from a point of view of providing a service to the customer. So here his concept was that when you look at ideas or people generating ideas within those quality circles, the key aspect was that, is that idea going to be focused on a particular customer? Is that something which is going to produce which a customer requires? And is that going to help them serve a customer better? And if that approach was taken, he felt that a customer-focused approach would also look at producing goods and services which would help the organization produce goods which are more in line with the expectation of the customers, but also because there's a keen interest in producing those, and when the employees work on it, would mean that they will follow and always adhere to the processes of quality, so that there are no compromises as far as the product produced is concerned. So in general, this particular aspect of looking at the employee engagement or empowerment through making them work within groups to come up with these ideas and focus on ideas which will help improve policies and processes to achieve savings in terms of costs or savings in terms of time, and then also not compromising on quality because that is what the customer wanted. And last but not the least, the other two ideas, which is to look at things like the continuous improvement and customer focus, overall implying that if these three things are put into action by any organization, then it will overall help the organization achieve the improvements in quality or the improvement in services which they would want to look at to gain competitive advantage, or look at serving their customers better.
Yeah, that's true. And you really can relate that to absolutely any organisation, can't you? I've
Yes,
just been thinking of different examples, and it is those concepts just relate to every single company
that's
in one
correct.
way or another. Yeah.
Absolutely right. And I think when we look at, in teaching and learning, we always continuously keep improving, giving feedback, formative, summative. These are all techniques which then are applicable across any segment, any sector, because this is where the whole idea is that they're trying to help the learner achieve higher grades in some cases. And the whole process is that you want basically something which the student or the learner or the customer wants is what they are able to achieve or get when you kind of put these things into action.
Yeah, it's really easy to relate it to the education sector, isn't it? And I think I've struggled a little bit with that in the past when I did like my finance qualification. I found
Yeah,
it difficult to relate the manufacturing side and the production side to what I was working with. But I find this really, really clear now. It is really simple to relate it to our sector.
yeah, that's correct. I think what my suggestion to you would be that I know that this particular unit, there are loads of things that you can put in. When you look at some of the handouts that I've shared, there are mostly journal, what they've done in those handouts and the way the books have been written, they've primarily looked at mostly services sector or, engineering or production organizations. But you could, because of the experience and obviously the sector that you work in, you could clearly bring across some of the examples which will relate to, obviously, the operation side of things. And I think I'll help you articulate them if required, because we do this day in, day out, at least from a point of view of, some of the concepts that we have studied in this unit, which clearly apply to any sector. And some of the examples that you bring, will show a bit of understanding and obviously help you relate it to, your organization internally, as far as learnings are concerned.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you said that because I was getting a bit concerned that I wouldn't be able to find enough examples of like the production side. But if I can relate it all to what I know about, then I think I will find it a little bit easier, to be honest, to think of more examples.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. I think the whole idea is we need to be able to apply some of this theoretical, knowledge into, I would say, our sector that we work in. And, from time to time, I will try and bring in a bit more example, because what I do is when I deliver some of these sessions, I tend to kind of pick up a lot of examples from our sector. But sometimes to give it a bit of differentiation, I try and kind of give you examples of the services sector in general, because when we look at our economy in general, there are 4 or 5 sectors which play a very key role. So services is one. You look at financial services. Within services, you have lots of different, but financial services, services in general, retailing, and we also look at in particular education, which is certainly a very big sector as far as UK is concerned.
Yeah.
Right. So my suggestion to you, Simone, would be if you go through the learning outcome 3 that was done last week and go through the recording, and if you have any questions or comments, then we could discuss that. Feel free to drop me an email, and I'll try and if required, we'll catch up on that to try and bring this unit to a bit of a close. Now, my suggestion to you would be on this, after going through some of the material and the handouts that I will send for LO4. The idea would be to try and start doing a bit of a draft on the assignment.
Yeah, I have already tried. I've started it. I have I've written about one side of A4, I think, but I think I might just start again with it, to be honest.
No, that's fine. It's okay. So in terms of what I'm going to do is, in terms of the second unit, I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to take it. And the idea is, because in this particular qualification, you have 10 units. What we want to be able to do is get one of the units, covered. I can start with either, say, human resources, or you would want to look at, say, for example, finance to be done with.
Yeah, let's get finance out of the way.
Okay. No, I understand that. I think that's a unit which,
but my least favorite.
That's fine. I think it's not. I don't think in the financial unit, we have lots of calculations and other bits, but typically, there will be sections which are more or less theoretical. And if I look at just that briefly, 1 second, I think on that side, what we're looking at is You'll have usual things like sources of finance and, financial statements, interpretation, you know, impact of cash flow. Yeah. So I don't think there is anything that they put in which primarily requires a bit of calculation, but yeah, it's more of understanding to look at how do you read financial statements, because you're looking at understanding budgets, and you're probably working with a lot of finances. So yeah, I can get this started for next week. So there are about 4 or 5 learning outcomes which we can cover in 4 or 5 sessions. And then what we will do is to get a bit of variation. Um, you know, this is uh, this is purely going to be a theoretical unit, but I think you'll need to understand some of the key things. In terms of we'll give you some practice sheets to work on, but it's not something that is required specifically apart from, I think, the task how to create and adjust budgets. Don't think there's
Yeah,
anything.
I think I'll be fine looking at those points with the finance.
There
Could I
should
have
be.
will we start on this next week then, or will I get a couple of weeks to make a good start on this assignment?
Yeah. I think what I would suggest is to get a working draft in place. My suggestion is you take the next 2 odd weeks to be able to create this draft, and then maybe as you work on this, we will continue with the other unit, and then once you've sent that draft over, we can give you some feedback and give you some pointers in terms of how to try and achieve the criteria set by the awarding organization to meet the objectives.
Okay.
Assuming if you don't do it the first time, I'm not assuming that that would happen, but yeah, I think there would be some areas, and I think what we want to be able to do is get the first one right, so that you understand what are the requirements and how to put this together. So in the first one, I think there will be a bit of suggestions or comments that we will give to get you to understand the basic things which ATHE looks at, which is pretty much similar to any organization, but it'll just be a bit of a refresh. So this is a joint kind of an exercise, but once you have produced the work, then I can, look at giving you some guidance on in terms of areas, just to quickly, refresh it, and then, obviously come to a final submission.
Okay. So if I try and get a draft over to you in a week, is that okay?
That's absolutely fine. I don't have a problem with that. I think you might want to, depending on how you're doing and how if you're flying with it and you're comfortable with all the things that we've covered, then my suggestion is, yeah, we would be good enough. If you're struggling, then take 2 weeks. But the idea is get a good working draft in place, and then that'll allow us to have a fuller discussion in terms of the assignment, the first one, and it'll allow on both sides the opportunity to understand, to give us from my side a bit of feedback, so that you're aware of the requirements, and on your side, you'll have the good idea in terms of asking a few questions, queries, to try and understand how to best meet the submission with ATHE.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's really reassuring as well. It is the actual writing up of it that I'm completely out of practice with. So I'm understanding everything you're saying to me, and I will go back and read through all these slides again. But it's just putting it onto paper that I'll find a little bit alien.
I think that's the area that that's the area that I'm hinting at. So a bit of referencing, a bit of citations, and I think what I will do is, once you've got that draft together, I'll give you some pointers in terms of just to understand what they look at. So they look at theory, application, and practice. So if you're picking up any task, you clearly look at just the points which talk about theory, the key concepts. Then you'd show a bit of application and then follow it up with a bit of an example. So application would involve underpinning that theory, or by, say, choosing an organization which will relate to the concept. And then towards the end, you're just kind of polishing it off with, or finishing it off with a bit of an example, for that particular task.
Yeah.
So that is where I think what we have to look at. And I hope, I'll obviously we'll work on this together. So I'll give you, some ideas in terms of how to, look at answering. So maybe as a start, what I would suggest is if you just do the LO1 and send that draft over, rather than doing the full assignment, just do the tasks related to LO1, and then you send that over to me, and I'll try and give you as much feedback as possible. If you're on the right lines, then obviously there's nothing, and then I'll ask you to just carry on. But in some cases, if I do find that you're missing a few bits in here and there, I'll give you some pointers to try and tell you can add this here, you can add that here, and it's not just generic. So, for example, if we talk about a task in this particular unit, say for example operations management, If it says explain the roles and characteristics of operations management, then I would say, okay, you've described what are the, start with the term operations management definition. Then, because it's saying within organization, pick up an organization, could be anything that you, say, for example, you pick up your own organization. And then in that, you explain the role of operations management and what are the key things that are involved in operations. That would cover the task.
Right.
Is that okay?
Explain the role. And then what was the last point that you just said?
So the first part would be to look at definition of operations management. The second,
then choose my organization.
And within that, what are the key things which are a part of organization, operations management, and then who, and basically explain a role. So explain somebody's role in the organization or what they do on a day in, day out basis.
Right.
So by 2-3 bullet points, as an example, the operations manager looks after 1, 2, 3, and that would be the example. The organization has been picked up, which is, say, your Rochelle College, and then you've done the definition of, the key term operations management. But when you do the coverage of your organization, you're explaining in 20-30 words in terms of what is the whole essence of operations within the college, and which, what are the key activities happening in that operational bit, and that would cover that task.
Right. That sounds brilliant. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
No worries. I'll catch up with you next week then, and hopefully not next week. So I'll catch up with you over the phone or otherwise. But I will.
Oh yeah,
then,
absolutely. I'll email something to you then, shall I? And then catch up over the phone after that.
Yeah, that's fine. And we'll send you the invites for the next unit, which you'll end up receiving, for this financial unit, which is Advanced Finance for Business Managers.
Right. Great. Thanks, Raman.
Thank you. Take care, Simone.